Hello, people of the worldwide interweb. This video is going to be a video on making stitch maps for low poly objects that have stitches on it. So in this case, I have this very simple shirt, which is just red. There's no detail of any kind. It's just a base mesh for a shirt, and I've made these stitches, and the stitches are done purely with maps as a texture. So if I go to the view here, you see there is no geometry, it's just maps. Okay, and let's look at the shader so we can see sort of a bit of a preview of how this is working. Okay, so we have our shader here, and it is this one. Now, it's very simple at this point. All I have on the shader, and I'll go closer here, is I have a principal BSDF, which just has a base color of red for the demo. This is the color of the shirt. Now, the color of the shirt doesn't have to obviously just be red. It could be whatever texture you have or whatever combination of textures you have that are going to give the actual material for the shirt. So it could be bump maps, textures, whatever you want, different color variations. So that's the red for the shirt. And in this, the only thing we have plugged in is there's a bump map. And the bump map is this, which is, if we'll go close here, which is the stitches, which are represented in white for the popped out part, and there's a shadow around it which gives this depression. And below that, there's another BSDF, another principal shader. And this one has a gray color because that's just the color for the stitches for this demo. And again, the same bump map is plugged into the normal slot. Now, I can change the color of the stitches, obviously, to whatever color I want. So if you see there above, I just changed it to some ridiculous looking fluorescent yellow, blue, whatever. It doesn't matter. The colors are variable. And of course, the shirt color could be whatever I want. Like I said before, it could be blue, it could be anything. It could be very much more complex with actual textures and surface details. So I have two shaders, one for the shirt, one for the stitches. Bump map plugged into both. Both are fed into a mix shader node, and the map which is selecting which is red and which is white is this map over here, which is clearly, as you see, the exact same pattern as we did before, but now instead of gray and white, it's black and white. All the black areas become the shirt material, the top shader. All the white areas become the bottom shader, which is the stitch material. So what we need to do, and what we're going to do in this video, is make these two maps. A bump map for the stitch relief, and the black and white map to separate the colors so we can have our different colors for the stitches and for the shirt. Okay, so let's take this off and we'll go to a version without any stitches. And I'll turn off the sub D surface modifier because I don't need that. And we'll just go to the regular tab so we don't have any texture. Okay, so first of all, we see that in this case, I have mirrored it just for the sake of the demo. Obviously, your object does not have to be mirrored. It's just for the sake of speed. And the other thing you see, hopefully, is that the object has been unwrapped. That's why I have these seams here. If I select everything and go to UV editing, you'll see that there is a very straight up UV map. It's very simple. I just broke the thing in half. So you can unwrap your object however you want, but it has to be unwrapped. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to need to do is determine where my stitches are going to be. And now, when you make your modeling, add edge loops or edges wherever you want the stitches. You need that for this technique, or for most techniques actually. So let's say I want the stitches to be here along the sleeve, kind of like the sleeve has been sewn on. And also I want one that's going along the center line here. So I have one set of stitches there and one separating the sleeve. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have to make a guide of where the stitches should be, and we're going to bring that into Photoshop. And I have to do it, and I'll explain it to you as I'm doing it. So let's do the sleeve one first. We said the sleeve guide is going to be, or the sleeve stitches are going to be there. There, actually, that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the loops all the way up until there. Right, that was it. So that's where my stitches are going to end. So I select all the way up to where my stitches will end. And this difference between the selection and the non-selected, that edge loop is going to be where my stitches are going to go. Okay, I'm going to go to UV editing. Because I've selected that piece, that's what I see in my tile here. So I'm going to press A. What I just did now is I pressed A to select that. And I'm going to go to UV, Export UV Layout. And what this is going to do as I actually did this before, so I'm going to call this thing sleeve guide. Obviously type it in for yourself, sleeve guide. Okay, I'm going to select the front section, but my stitches aren't going up to the seam, they're going one loop before that, so I just press Control minus, which is just, or I could go select less. And now I have, again, that edge loop is where the stitches are going to go. So now I have this whole section selected, export UV layout, and I'm going to call this center, well, I already did, center guide, center guide. Call it whatever you want. Okay, so now we have all the stuff that we need for Photoshop. Let's go to Photoshop. I'll save this to be sure. Let's go to Photoshop. All right, here we are in Photoshop with a blank page. Now I'm going to show you, we're going to make what's called a stitch brush. Let me just show you what a stitch brush is if I just go freehand. Doodly 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 doo. I'm making stitches with a stitch brush. So obviously it's a brush that creates a stitch-like pattern, which we have to make. Now what's interesting about Photoshop, or what you can do is, I just do this freehand. So obviously I could just draw stitches directly on a map if I wanted to. But that's not that precise. Since we already have our edge loops in the right position, we want to be able to use that information to put our stitches and not have to just draw them, trace them. We could, but we probably can do better than that. So let me just undo these things. If we had some kind of a path, whatever the path is, whatever it is, some kind of path, any kind of path, what we could do is we could make our stitches follow this path exactly. And how do we do that? If we go to the Paths tab here, I have just made what's called a work path, which is a temporary path. If I want to make sure that I'm on my brush there, my stitch brush, I have my black color selected for my stitch brush. If I right click on this work path and I go onto stroke path, it's going to basically replicate this pattern, the path pattern with the stitch brush. So I do that, it selects brush, which is the brush we just used. I says yes. I get rid of that, and lo and behold, now the stitches follow exactly our path. So we're going to take advantage of this technique for making our stitches in the object. Okay, let me get rid of that. Let me get rid of that. We don't need any of that stuff. Da, 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 da. Now what we're going to do is let's make the actual stitch brush, because I cheated and I showed you one that was already made. Let's make one from scratch. To do that, I'm going to select, in this case, the rounded rectangle tool, which is one of the shape tools. You could also use the ellipse tool, which I think is the only thing you can use in the modern version of Photoshop is the ellipse tool. I have Photoshop 2020, so I can use this rounded rectangle tool. But it's just to make the shape of one stitch. So I'll take this rounded rectangles tool, and I'm going to basically figure out, let's see my stitch, the actual stitch, one stitch. Let's say it's maybe like that. Obviously it's gigantic, but that's not the point. Now, before I wanted a round stitch because this is just like a rectangle. In the rounded rectangle tool, if you go to here and I change the numbers here, for example, if I press 80, this is going to give me more of a rounded look. Maybe I might even do even more round. All right, that's pretty good for my stitch. And I noticed that my stitch is a little thick, so I'm going to make the width a little bit less, maybe more like that, maybe that. This is now the perfect stitch that's ever been done. Okay, so far I have this shape filled in with black, but it's not actually rasterized yet because it's still just this shape. So I'm going to do is rounded rectangle. I'm going to right click this and I'm going to go rasterize layer. And now it's going to make this into an actual layer. So this is the basic shape of my stitch. But what I want to make is a stitch that kind of pops out in the middle so it gives it a bit more realism. So to do that, I'm going to select everything. I'm going to select the stitch. Hold on. Select the stitch itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the selection in a little bit. I'll contract the selection by, I don't know, 40 pixels. Okay. And I am going to sort of feather this. Maybe 40 pixels also. Okay. Now you're probably wondering why I'm doing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically make the outside a little less dark. So to do this, I'm going to put have my paint tool, have my white, And I'm going to have to invert my selection. And now I'm basically just dumping some white along those edges there. All right, that's not too bad. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this selection. And I'm actually just going to blur this because this is a very harsh looking line. And you'll understand what I'm going to do in a second. It's a bit too much. Okay, let's go with that. Now that I've done this weird looking shape, I'm going to select the thing that I have. And this is going to become my brush. To make a brush from any shape, I go up here to edit and I go define brush preset. And I'll call this thing stitch for video. And you see that this white, this is what it looks like. So if it was a bump map, it's more white in the middle, which means it's more sticking out in the middle and less and more faded on the side. So it gives a bit of an illusion of relief. Great. Now I'm going to try this out and you're going to see what is going on here. It's just like one stitch. So if I do this, oh, I got to get rid of the selection. If I do this, boom, I just have a bunch of random stitches, which is obviously not what I want. I have to make this into that brush that I showed you before. So to do that, it's pretty easy. I go to the brush selection thing here. And first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush tip shape. I'm going to make this brush way, way, way smaller. I'll make it something like that. And now where it says spacing here, I'm going to make it spaced apart. And now you start to see, wait a second. Now instead of one thing, there's many, 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 many things. Many, many strokes. Now also you see that the strokes are in the wrong position. I want stitches that are going to go in the same direction as the stroke direction. So I'm going to change this from 0 to 90. And you see, whoop, now it's following that. Now we're still not quite there yet. If I were to use this, and I go a little bit closer, you see it's not quite right because the strokes are not following in the right direction. So I have to do something. I go to Shape Dynamics and where it says Angle Jitter, Control Direction. Now let's do that again. Now it's following the direction of the stroke. And finally, to give it a bit of variation, this here is the randomness percentage. If I can put this up a little bit, it's going to make it a little bit less perfectly even and give it a little bit of variation. Like I can put this way up here. Let's just do it at 20%. Now it's kind of going all crazy all over the place. I just maybe want a little bit of variation so my stitches aren't perfect. They're good, but not perfect. Okay, so let's try that again. I think that's probably pretty good for now. And there's our brush. We've just made a stitch brush. And the stitch brush that you've made is now saved in your, hold on, where are we? In your brushes, Stitch for Video. All right, so now we're going to bring in those maps that we made in Photoshop and we're going to do the stitches using our stitch brush. So since I have a couple of maps to bring in, I go to a new scripts and I'm going to load files into Stack. This allows me to bring a couple of pictures at the same time. I just need the center guide and the sleeve guide. Okay. And all right. So before moving on, I want to make a new layer that's going to be the background. So I'm going to press Shift Control N. That's going to be background. And I'm going to flood this thing with black. I'm going to put it in the back. And what I do want to do is I want to resample this whole thing. The actual map so far was at 1K. It's a little low for something like this because it'll give results that are a bit lo-fi. Now, you could make your maps at 4K, which would give much clearer resolution. For the video, I'm doing them at 2. You might want to do them at 4. Obviously, you can do them at 8 if you want, if you're really crazy. So we have a background, and we have the pattern for the center. Remember, the stitches are going to go here and here. And then we also have this. The stitches are going to go here and here. So we have stitches for the sleeves and then stitches for the center line. Now, because the stitches overlap each other perpendicularly, that's why I'm doing them in 2 separate layers. If you have just stitches that are sort of never going to touch each other, you can just do one pattern for the whole thing. But I'm doing them in layers because I have this and I want to be able to do them each independently. Okay, so now that I've resampled it and I have my sleeve guide, I'm going to create the paths that my stitch brush will follow. Okay, I'm going to select this. This selects everything, Shift Control I. will invert the selection. So now I have a marquee around my islands. All right, now what I want to do is I want to create a new layer. Shift Control N, and this is going to be called Stitch Sleeve. And this is where I'm actually going to draw the stitches. And I'm going to make another one. Shift Control N, Stitch Center. So these are my two layers in which I'm going to draw my stitches. Okay, so I have my sleeve guide, which I don't need. And I want to do my stitch sleeve layer. I'm going to make the stitches for the sleeve. All right, I have these two things selected. How do I turn this to a path? Well, kids, it's pretty easy. You go to the Paths tab, and you press this little doodad. And now the selection has turned into a work path. And this, if I were to, I could make the stitch brush follow this entire path. Now I don't want the whole path because I don't need stitches all over the place. I just want them here. So I'm just going to chop out what I don't need by using this tool, Direct Selection tool. I select the things I don't want, and I just press delete. Click on this one. I'll do the same thing here. This one I don't want. That I don't want. And now I have just what I need. Cool. So I'm going to select that one, shift select this one. Now they're both selected. I want to fill these with stitches. So at this point, my paint was on black, which is not what I want. I want white stitches. I flip that. I have white stitches. And my stitch brush is already loaded into the brush palette. So it's going to fill this with whatever I have selected, and I have my stitch brush selected. Right click on this and press stroke path. It says tool the brush, yep. And now if I unclick it by doing this, you see that I have my stitches. When I get a bit closer, look at that, it's wonderful. So those are my stitches for my sleeve. Now I'm gonna just do exactly the same thing. I'm gonna get rid of this just so I don't have to see it. And I go to my center guide, which is the guide I'm gonna use for the center. I'm gonna do exactly the same thing. Select that, Shift Control I to select just that island. Now I don't need this anymore. And I need to go to my stitch center, go to paths, create a new work path. If I click this again, it'll replace my sleeve thing with this. Now I have my work path there, and I'm going to just remove everything I don't need with my direct selection tool. So I don't need that, I don't need that, and I don't need that. So I just need this. Right click on that, stroke path, cool, wonderful, and it looks weird like that, but if I go close, it's there. Okay, so now I have that, and I have my stitch sleeve, I have my two stitches, and I'm going to save this thing as Stitch Factor. And I already made one, but I'm going to replace it. Stitch Factor is what we call it. So we're going to go back to Blender and try this out and make sure that that thing worked. If it worked, we'll keep going. Image texture. I just added an image texture, and I'm going to open up the thing we just did, Stitch Factor. And this is my kind of model from before with no stitches. Plug this just directly in the base color so I can see what's going to happen. And lo and behold, it looks pretty damn good. There's a little Nunak here, which I could fix in the texture paint if I wanted to. That'd be pretty easy to fix by just painting it. But I'm not going to do that for this video. I'm just going to keep it like that. You can fix it and refine it. So I have my pattern, which is where I wanted it. It looks pretty good. Now, what am I going to do with this weird looking black and light thing? Well, let's build the shader like we did we saw in the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to undo this, keep that red, and I'm going to duplicate this. For now, I'm just going to make, again, like kind of white stitches. Just for the sake of 0, and maybe kind of grayish. All right, I have one shader which is red, one shader which is grayish. I'm going to add what's called a mix shader. I'm going to stick it in there. The top shader will go to the red, the bottom shader will go to the white or whatever stitch color you want. And I take my stitch factor and I plug it into the factor because it's the factor that's determining what is stitches and what is shirt. And look at that, I have my stitches in the right place. And of course, I can change whatever color I want. I just made them red and white for the sake of this thing. but you can do whatever you want. Now, there's one problem is that we only have the color. We don't actually have the bump part. We don't have any relief. So it's very sad. So how are we going to make the bump map? Well, let's go back to Photoshop, kids. And instead of having a black background, Shift Control N, I'm going to make a medium gray background. And I'm going to go here and choose 50% gray for the background of the bump map. And of course, I flood it in, and it covers everything, but I stick it in back. Now, if I go here, you see I still have exactly the same stitches, which are white, and I have a black background. I have a gray background. Gray means it won't change anything about the model. So far, this is just pushing the stitches out. So now I have stitches that pop out. But I do want a bit of a depression underneath the stitches because, normally in stitching, there's a bit of a depression. So how am I going to make that? Well, let's do this. This is the fun part. I'm going to select these two stitch things. And for now, I'm just going to combine them. I'm going to merge these two things together. Those are all of our stitches. Now I'm going to duplicate the stitches. Duplicate layer. Great. And I'm going to call this stitch shadow. Stitch shadow. And I'll put it below the main stitches. Now, so far, it's just exactly the same thing. So I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm just seeing this stitch shadow. I want to turn this into a darker color. Image, adjustments, selective color. Because the stitches are white, I want to change them. I want to make them black. I just took the white and turned up all the way to the black. So now this is all very nice, except for the stitches are exactly the same place as the white ones, and you won't see them. I need to blur them out a little bit so they bleed past the highlighted part. So I'm going to go to a blur, Gaussian blur. And that's way too much blur. Maybe something like that. Okay. And if I put the ones on top now, you see I'm starting to have some kind of a shadow underneath those stitches. The shadow is kind of not dark enough. So one thing I want to do is I just want to duplicate this. Right click on this and just duplicate it. And I'm just going to stick these two things together so that I just kind of punched up my shadow. Merge layers. All right, let's see how that looks now. Let's see how this looks. This is going to be my bump map so far. Save as stitch bump. And I'll put it in the same place. Okay, now I go to Photoshop. We'll go to Blender, and I have my sad looking thing with just color, and I need to add my bump. So I'm going to add bump, put it over there, and I'm going to duplicate my image texture here so I have something to actually load my map into. So I get rid of this. I don't want that. I want my bump map. Bump. Put the bump on no color, plug it into the height, and then plug this into the normal there, and plug this into the normal there as well. Both. Ah, whoa. Now we have Ayoi. That's a pretty deep depression. Crazy, I know. And we probably don't need that much punch. But of course, now we can go with the height and the strength, and we can push that bump in or out and do whatever we want. And now we have a nice groove. And of course, it's really crazy, but you can adjust that in Photoshop and or in Blender. And there you are. Of course, you could refine the hell out of this, but this is the basic technique. Thank you. I hope this was useful.